Welcome to Luminaria, the podcast where we shine a big ol' light on New Mexico history and genealogy. I'm Kat, and I'm riding solo again today to talk about my Alires line. Very different trajectory than the Pacheco line, very different story. However, there are some parallels, of course, in New Mexico history and genealogy. Things just keep wrapping around each other in this small community, in a small area. So in going back to do a little research in my notes to come up with the outline for this episode, even though this sounds like it's very random and rambling, I actually put together outlines for the episodes, believe it or not. I remembered just with an absolutely devastating punch in the gut that about a year or so ago, I lost some of my genealogy records. The way that I document my genealogical finds and my history that I find is in Google Docs, and I do it chronologically. I don't know why. I've never seen anybody else do it this way. It's the only way that makes sense to me. When I have trees on Ancestry and I use Family Search, but that just doesn't make sense to me visually. I need to see it in a different way. It's just names and places when I look at it that way. So I have documents for all of my lines, and I go chronologically. So it starts with the earliest record that I found, and then I just keep plugging in as I find more records or find more notations. I plug those in chronologically. This just works well for me, and I find it's also very helpful for me to follow like a narrative, and also it helps me draw connections. So I typically will do this for, let's say, my dad's paternal lines, Romero and Alires. So I have Romero and Alires together so that I can see, I don't know where the Alire family was during this time period, but I can see where the Romeros were. And often it helps me think of places to look or make inferences or locate siblings, things like that. And it's just a cool way to kind of tell a story about your ancestors and fleshes out their lives a little bit more than just looking at a tree. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but it makes sense to me. The flaw in this plan is that I use a Google Doc. To me, and I'm a sort of youngish person who knows about the internet, but I didn't think things through. I'm also not super organized. I also don't have a ton of free time. So things just sort of fall through the cracks. I think in the back of my mind, I kind of thought of Google Docs as it was already in the cloud. So it's not like on a hard drive that's going to get erased or compromised or whatever. However, the internet has become an unruly place. And also, over the last couple of years, we've had a labor shortage. Things just aren't really working the way that they used to. I think those days are over for us. I think we got really spoiled that everything just sort of worked all the time, and that's not true anymore. This is all to say that I lost my genealogical documents for my two main lines about a year or so ago. This coincided with a time period when I had to clean out my Google storage because I was running out of storage, because I don't ever delete anything, but in particular, I don't ever delete emails. So that maybe tells you something about me, I don't know. But I needed to clear out some storage. I will not accept that I accidentally deleted these files. I don't think that's possible. Maybe things are just getting deleted or things just aren't working on the interwebs the way that we think it should work. We think it's magic, and it's not. It's run by human beings. So that is all to say, I am missing some information, and I think I have all, like, it's paper records that I still have, obviously, but it's more like that labor of when I was looking up records and then I was recording it in these documents. So I'm missing a lot of information chronologically, so I'm having to use the cloud storage of yesteryear, which is my brain, which is scary. So there's a lot of information I'm kind of just going to have to remember. I will say, first of all, that I was able to recover 2 versions of those documents by looking through like emails and stuff like that. So it's not a total loss, but it's, every time I think about it, I want to just curl up in a closet and die. So I kind of had forgotten that this happened until I looked into my notes for this episode and just relived the horror all over again and the pain. So this is all to say, it's all going to be worth it. My suffering will be worth it if you pause this episode right now and go make sure that your files are backed up. I don't mind serving as a cautionary tale if it will serve the community. So don't be like me, be responsible, back up, have several different copies and versions of your files that you've worked so hard on. So back to the Alires. The Alires line really starts with my dad's grandma Romero, as that's what he called her. They also called her little grandma. She was teeny tiny. And there's some cute pictures of her grandsons holding her, just really adorable. She also mainly went by Tonita. Her name was Antonita Alires, Maria Antonia Alires, but she went by Tonita. I remember distinctly when I had to do a genealogy or family tree project when I was in middle school, I remember writing out her name and kind of thinking about it for a minute. At that time, I knew her as Alires with a Z. Of course, now I know that was something that didn't happen until later. It, of course, was with an S earlier than that, and before that, it was just Alire. Tonita Alires was a presence in Colorado Springs when my dad was growing up. He didn't really have a relationship after a certain point with his father and his father's side of the family. Long story, but he did still go visit his grandma even into adulthood. She was born in 1880 and she lived until 1973. So she lived a long life over there in the same house in Colorado Springs. She only spoke Spanish. It's unclear to me how, I think that when my dad was growing up, he had limited I guess he could understand her. Let's see. I feel like someone were telling me that she actually did understand English, but she pretended that she didn't. And she would only speak Spanish with people, even like grandchildren who maybe didn't know Spanish. And they just seemed to understand each other. I'm not quite sure how it worked. So she lived in this little house in Colorado Springs on what was then the outskirts of town. And she never had running water, as far as I know. They had an outhouse in the back. Lots of family stories about that outhouse. And they also had a well. And my dad does remember that, you had to, the kids had to go have the chore of filling up the jug. And there was a little, like a tin cup on top of the jug. And that's where you would get your drink of water. And she would give a blessing whenever the children would leave, I believe. So they had to kneel before her and I think maybe kiss her hand. And she would give a blessing in Spanish. However, she had a rosary, and I think they said that she didn't actually ever go to church. I can't confirm that. But I did hear a story that she and the aunts, her daughters who lived with her, used to practice some kind of unknown religious practices in the basement involving chicken sacrifices and whatnot, and candles. So I, of course, very curious to know more about that. But she's just sort of this, she was a presence in my dad's life. And they would go visit, even my older siblings went to go visit her at her little house in the Springs until she passed away in 1973. And so Tanita was born in Huerfano County, Colorado in 1880 to Pablo Alires and Filomena Romero. And my dad I do remember my dad knowing that piece of information about her. And when we would drive up 25 and, you can see the little orphan, the little huerfano, off to your right when you're driving up 25 towards Denver. And my dad would comment, my grandmother was born around here. They used to mention that she was born in this area. And there were also rumors that she was Ute. She had a very distinct look. And so I don't know if it was based on just her looks or if there was some stories around that. I'm not sure. But as I learned her history, I don't think that there's any truth to that unless I uncover somebody going back, which is totally a possibility. So they were in Huerfano County, presumably, they could have been mining, I guess, but probably farming, maybe sheep, obviously we're big in that area. And then they started moving north into Pueblo. And in Pueblo, they lived at Salt Creek. And so presumably they worked at the steelworks there in Pueblo, as many Hispano people did at Salt Creek. And the family gradually all started moving to Colorado Springs starting in around 1903. Now, this is a wild claim that I have made, in the privacy of my own home with people that I know. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. If someone has something to counter this, I am very open to hearing it. But I believe that they were the first Hispano family to move to Colorado Springs. Obviously, there's a divide of the Arkansas River in Pueblo, ton of Hispano people, Pueblo and south in Colorado, and not very many for a long time in Colorado Springs. The reason that I make this claim is that when I look at the church records, the baptismal records, sacramental records in Colorado Springs, my family is the first family that appears in those records on a consistent basis. So I can't obviously say why they made that move. It seems like they made a pretty bold move going up there. They did, I believe, work in the slaughterhouse that was on the south edge of town. Let's see, that would be south, right? Yes. At that time, probably would have been, it was along Fountain Creek. I don't totally want to know how they were using the creek in that slaughtering process. Probably not pretty. I did last time we went down to the Springs I filmed my uncle and my dad driving around their old neighborhood in the Springs, and we drove past the old house on Hugo Street down by Fountain Creek, and my uncle said that the outhouse actually was far enough back that the outhouse emptied out into Fountain Creek. So that's sanitary. Sorry, Colorado Springs. Sorry, anyone who lived downriver or down creek. There was just a lot of stuff in that water. I apologize for that. The house where they lived on Hugo Street, they moved there. They started living there, I believe, in 1903. And the family lived there consistently, different members of the family on and off, sometimes all at once, until 1973 when my grandmother passed away. And then it was still lived in by some of the aunts, and then I believe they sold it in like the mid 80s. So the house is still there. It's in the middle of a junkyard at this point in time, but it's still fun to go by there and see it and reminisce, have them reminisce about their times there. And also the photos that we have of early days in that house are just really incredible. If you are from Colorado Springs or interested in the area, really fascinating to understand what that area was at that time versus, of course, what it looks like now. So Tonita married Manuel Romero in 1894 at St. Patrick's in Pueblo. I cannot find a record of Manuel Romero or his family. Prior to that record, it's my Adobe brick wall. It is my life frustration. Hope to solve it at some point. I will have an episode on the Romero line, however brief that might be. Maybe somebody can help me break through that. I don't know. Many people have taken on that challenge in the past, and I applaud anybody who would try that again. So the whole family, Tonita had two sisters, along with her parents, Pueblo and Filomena. They all ended up in Colorado Springs at that house on Hugo Street by like 1905. They were all there pretty consistently. Sometimes some of the family would go back to Pueblo probably to do some work at the steelworks. But they were all pretty much in Colorado Springs, either working for the railroad or the slaughterhouse. Supposedly that's why most of the brothers were missing fingers. And would bring back blood and bits and pieces from the slaughterhouse for Tonita to cook up for the family. Barf. Did not seem to have any impact whatsoever on their health. They all seemed to live a very long time, including Tonita, even though she was allegedly always with a beer in her hand. And she's the one that taught my aunt, her granddaughter, to roll her own cigarettes. So you never know. Live it up. They're just frying up some blood. So the household stayed intact in that house on Hugo Street, one down the street, consistently for years and years and years, which included the three sisters, their families, and their father, Pueblo. Their mother, Filomena, died, I think, in 1905 of, I believe, appendicitis. So Pueblo was kind of on his own with his daughters, dependent on them. He did not pass away until 1921. So looking back to his history, I want to throw a shout out to the Colorado death records are really, really helpful. I found so many really helpful death records from Vital Records there. Also, Colorado Marriages is a really great resource. They have all the marriages in Colorado for a long period of time, starting pretty early, that are all indexed on a really helpful index that's available online. So I have found some of the records in Colorado I've had a lot of issues locating. I got into several fights with the Diocese of Colorado Springs and Denver. Maybe it was just Colorado Springs. And I just went there to ask for, my father, for one thing, was baptized and had his sacraments in that diocese, along with my family for years and years. And I had to go finally to the actual building of the diocese, and they stared at me like I was crazy. Like they'd never heard of this before. I explained the whole thing. They were like, "You don't understand. These are sacramental records. These are very sacred acts. You can't just look at them. You can't just." They said, "If you want to tell us the name and the date of like your father's baptism, we could have our archivist." They had an archivist look it up for you and send it to you. And I was like, well, it's really helpful to look through the books, because that's how you discover family members you didn't know that you had, that maybe were baptized but then they passed away as children, marriages you didn't know about, etc. Godparents are really helpful, that kind of thing. They were not having any of it. And I had to say, literally, you can walk across the street to the public library in Colorado Springs, was across the street, I believe on Kiowa maybe. And there's like a whole room, shelf after shelf after shelf of sacramental records that you can just look through. They did not give an S about any of this. I had to go back and forth about it with them for years. This went on. I would go back every time I went to the Springs to visit. I would go back. We'd do this again. Well, flash forward a couple of years ago, those guys put all of the records online. They're on Ancestry now. I just about died. So, c'est la vie. They're online now to look at. Pablo Alires was born in 1834 to Juan Antonio Alire and Maria Manuela Valdez in Ojo Caliente. He's married with 2 kids in the 1860 census, and then things get interesting. So in 1860, he's living as a servant in another man's household with, Pablo's wife and his 2 kids at Los Luceros. If you remember my episode on the Pachecos, at the same time period, Antonio Maria Pacheco was working as the sheriff out of the hacienda at Los Luceros. So it's interesting to think about these 2 men living in such proximity to each other. And one is obviously not a very high status person working as a servant in a household. The other has a very high ranking leadership role in the county. And thinking about, generations later, their descendants meeting each other and getting married is really fascinating. What if you had approached them at that time, if I had got in my DeLorean and went back to that time period and told each of them that was going to happen, I wonder what they would think. As you know, during this time period, we're looking at August 1861. There was recruitment in that area for volunteers for the Union Army as the New Mexico involvement in the Civil War started. And Pablo joined up. And he was serving in the Union Army for about a year in New Mexico. He saw action at Valverde. He actually was discharged just before Glorieta. Just before Glorieta. Presumably, he was recruited out of his position at Los Luceros in that area. And we know from his service record, that he had a really bad A horse. So the very helpful ranger at Fort Union told me that, sometimes you could get somebody to take your place, serve for you. A wealthy individual could pay money, I think, and send somebody else to serve in their place. And they might send their horse along. With presumably Pablo as a servant did not maybe own his own horse, or it wasn't probably the highest quality horse. But he took a really nice horse to Fort Union with him when he served up. And it promptly was confiscated by the officers. So the ranger at Fort Union said that was pretty common because the officers were from the east. They would come out with their own horses. They had some highfalutin east horses that couldn't really hack it out in the sort of rough western climate. And so they would often commandeer horses from local people. So that's what happened to poor Pablo. I don't know what happened to his. I don't know. Did he not have a horse anymore? Did they give him a crappy horse? I don't know. I can't remember. He did then have in August 1861, around the same time period that he was serving, he did have a daughter who was born in Conejos in Colorado. Just follow the timeline here. She actually died sadly in January of the next year. So she was only a couple months old. She passed away, unfortunately. Then he enlists again in November 1863, and he's serving in the Union Army in Colorado this time under a different name. So this time he's going by Pablo Serto, Serto. And he served under that name in the Bloody Third during the Sand Creek Massacre. So Pablo is one of my favorite ancestors to talk about. He's a real colorful character. He is often referred to affectionately as that rascal or that scoundrel Pablo because he abandoned his family at this time and changed his name. So he did have the wife and 2 kids, and then they had that 3rd child who passed away. But the 2 surviving children were with their mother, I think got left in Conejos at Guadalupe. And then he changed his name, and then I lose track of him for some time period. I guess this is sort of common. I've heard this from other people and in other parts of the country as well, that, he was a servant working in somebody else's household. That's probably not ideal for him. He gets a little taste of adventure during the war. They were traveling quite a bit. He probably saw quite a bit of landscape, quite a bit of other parts of New Mexico possibly. My theory is that maybe there were Colorado volunteers that came down from Colorado to serve, I believe at Valverde and Glorieta. And so maybe they were talking things up. Maybe he followed them back up to Fort Garland, left his first wife behind. So then I lose track of him for a couple of years, and he pops back up around 1879 around Walsenburg, which at that time was the Plaza de los Leones. Forgive my lack of Spanish. And that's where he hooks up with Filomena. At this time, Filomena was 14. Pablo was 40-ish. Those were their approximate ages. So not a great situation for Filomena. I don't know what her story is exactly, but I've often felt a tug towards Filomena for several different reasons. But I kind of lose track of her family for a little bit before then, but she was born in 1860 in Arroyo, Hondo. And I believe that the family, a common migration pattern was for some of those families to go northward through the San Luis Valley. So I lose track of her for a little bit, but then, she appears in the Walsenburg La Plaza de los Leones area, and I guess hooks up with Pablo Surto at that time. I don't know where he got that name. I think maybe it could be Dutch, but it sounds like maybe he kind of made it up. I don't know. He hooks up with Filomena outside of that area around Walsenburg. They start having a bunch of babies. They had the 3 remaining daughters that survived, Tonita, her sister Ursulita, and their sister Simferosa. Simferosa later, I believe, was a translator in Colorado Springs and would work with people who only spoke Spanish and who weren't literate to get their documents translated and help them out at the courthouse in Colorado Springs. So, and she died very young. She has a very tragic story. She's also very, very beautiful. So, but they had a lot of other children as well. They just didn't survive. So it's interesting because there's lots of baptismal records, therefore, for us to look through. And there was a lot of times Pablo's not mentioned because they were not married, because he was married previously, still married, and had abandoned his first wife. However, in one of the baptismal records, there's a note in sketchy Latin that both parents were married to other people. I can't find any evidence that Filomena was married to anybody else, so I'm not sure if maybe this priest got his wires crossed or what the deal was, but they did finally officially get married civilly in 1897, and I believe that corresponds with when Pablo's first wife passed away in Conejos. And so that also kind of says to me that maybe Filomena hadn't been married to somebody else. It might have just been referring to Pablo. So they had to wait until she passed away, which also, does that mean that Filomena must have known that he had this other wife and other family out there that he had abandoned? I don't know. She probably didn't have a whole lot of agency or say in the situation. They did finally legitimately get married in 1897. In 1894, Pablo applied for a pension for his service in the Civil War, And I was able to get all of those records at the National Archives. There were so many records. It's amazing. So much information in there, including he sort of tries to account for his name change. It doesn't do a great job at it, but he just sort of says, oh, I also served under the name Jose Pablo Alires, but I also served up here as Pablo Certo, and it's just because that was my father's name. Well, then he sort of tried to explain that. I guess they bought it, and actually he has a military service headstone in Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs. On his headstone it says Pablo Certo. So that's interesting. But it, tells a lot of information about his service. He says that he got run over by a wagon in 1875, 30 miles east of Pueblo. And he gives witnesses and they kind of tell the story, give their testimony. I think that might have been, is it not Avondale, but could it be Ottoby's Ranch? Possibly. I heard a presentation about the Ottoby Ranch, or what they were trying to unearth the original location of the homestead. And I think it got me thinking. See, I'm having to use this old-fashioned cloud storage known as my brain. It's not working. It's been a rough couple of years. So maybe that was where he was. It would make sense. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff going around in that area at that time. So maybe that's where he was. Doesn't say what he was doing. Was he running freight? Was he a mountain man? Who knows what he was up to after the war? I still don't really know. But he lists this as an injury that he hurt his leg and his back. It says that he's now blind because at Sand Creek, he was firing a gun and the powder blew back into his eye or something. So he is claiming on his pension that he was injured at Sand Creek as a part of the Bloody Third, Crimea River, Pueblo. He also says he can't walk and he has stomach issues. So some of the neighbors give testimony that he's quite a feeble old man. He can't really walk. There's all of this stuff going on and on and on. Meanwhile, I'm looking over here in the baptismal records. He's having 1 million children with Philomena. Beleaguered Philomena. He's 60 at this point and she's 34. What a life. And then she died of appendicitis a couple of years later. She's really poor Philomena. I got some photos from a cousin several years ago, and one of the photos was a bunch of little kids, of course, in front of the house on Hugo Street in the Springs, sitting on the lap of the oldest man in the world. He just looks like he's a zillion years old. He's clearly blind. And there are crutches propped up on the house in the background. And I just looking back at his pension records, this has to be Pablo as a very old man. He lived well into his 80s, didn't die until 1921. So what a life he had. And his arc is just really interesting. I mean, he was a servant. He wanted to serve in the military, have an adventure, have some freedom. He did have honorable service out Valverde. And I know this because I visited Fort Union and I let the ranger know that, I think when we got there that I had an ancestor who had served through there. And so while we were going through the exhibits and walking through outside and everything, he looked up his service record, which was different information than I found at the National Archives. I actually don't know what database he was using to get that information. It was on Who Do You Think You Are, where they just do all this work for you and just sit you down and they're like, hey, and then this happened, and then this happened. It was incredible. I'm so grateful to that ranger. So he said, he was able to say the thing, stuff about the horse, that he had lost this cap on his ammunition, whatever, and he had to pay for it out of his stipend or whatever. And that his unit was actually quite heroic at Valverde. That was a Union loss, that battle, but there was a particular unit that really showed a lot of courage in the face of it, in a face of defeat. And he was in that unit. So he actually had honorable service at Valverde, but then he abandoned his family and he was at absolutely horrendous action at Sand Creek. And I encourage you to visit the Sand Creek historic site. It's it's not near anything, so you really got to make a trip out there. You could visit Bent's Fort, Boggsville. Also, you should go visit Amachi Japanese American internment camp is also in that same area, so it's worth a trip. There was a really cute bed and breakfast in Granada. We stayed there, and I think we also on the way back stayed in Eads. So I recommend a trip out there for sure. So I encourage you to look into Sand Creek and what happened there was absolutely atrocious. Again, ups and downs, good and bad. He seemed to be a loyal father to his daughters, or possibly he was just dependent on them for survival. But he, lived with them. He was part of their family. He obviously was engaged with his grandchildren, those young children of Tonita's and her sisters. I have another photo from my cousin of Pueblo as a young man, and it's one of those curved glass portraits, and it's of him as a young man and Tonita as a young woman. And the cousin said that she heard that it was taken on Tonita's wedding day. And I was confused by these portraits. First of all, why would you have a portrait of you and your father on your wedding day? It seems a little weird, but I don't know. But, I learned that they would sort of take a photo from like a different eras, and then they would paint them together. So it's Pablo as a young man, the father, and then the daughter as a young woman. Together they look like a couple, but it's actually father and daughter. Clearly he meant a lot to Tonita. And so we have these conversations lately about history and sort of only wanting to talk about the good or honorable things. And I'm guilty of this. I did start with the Pacheco line that is, I'm very proud of and had lots of accomplishments, lots of honorable things. But the sum of all of these parts led us to being here today. And we have to accept that maybe some of our ancestors were not completely honorable. They didn't always do the right thing. They had some terrible behavior. But we can resolve to bring a different energy into the world, and that's part of our sort of healing trauma and things from the past in our line. So like I visited Sand Creek last year and said a prayer, apologized for my ancestors' role and any suffering that was caused there, with a resolution to support Native rights and sovereignty, and to share the story of Sand Creek and other atrocities. There are others as well that people need to know about and learn from. I'm excited to learn more about the Alire in Ojo Caliente. On a family trip we took once there, we ate at a cafe and we're chatting with the waitress, as you do, about why we were there. And it turns out she was an Alire descended from one of Pablo's siblings who stayed in the area. And I would love for an excuse to visit the hot springs, which I've actually never done before. I would love to know what the springs were like during the era when Pablo was growing up there. Maybe I'll report in next time soaking in some therapeutic waters. So I'll see you then. Thanks for listening to Luminaria. You can reach me at luminariapod@gmail.com. Our intro and outro music is of Varsoviana, performed by Nieves Anaya and his daughter Ernestina Anaya at Arroyo, Hondo, New Mexico in 1940. It's part of the Juan Bautista Rael collection at the Library of Congress.